All right, guys, Copper Cutlass here. I came out here today after doing a bunch of stuff out in the house. I should say in the house, not out in the house. But I guess if you're talking from my garage to the house, that would be out in the house. God damn it, I drive myself nuts sometimes. Either way, so I came out here, and it's one of the very few times where I have a degree to cam, and it literally went perfect, and it took me 10 minutes. It took me longer to set everything up, make sure everything is good. Now, the important thing is when you degree your camshaft, is that your degree wheel, this is small, bigger would be a lot better. It just makes it more consistent, easier to read everything, that everything is stable. Your indicator, you have a good stop, mine bolts in, and that's going to go a long way. That's going to make your job easier. And I think this is one of the first times where I really figured out with my ghetto setup how to set it up to make it work for me fairly fast, and this time it went perfect. So I use a combination of techniques. It depends on how you degree the camshaft, but a lot of people go by the intake centerline method, and that's to get this number. And some people will do the opening and closing events. So I checked my opening and closing events, and they were all within a half a degree. And when I did the intake center line, we were off by 2 degrees. So if you split the difference, we're within like a degree and a half, which I think will be fine because we are in between this. So the lobe center is 112. Installed, the intake center line, which would be as installed, means it was ground with some advance in it, I believe. We're in between that, so we're good. We're not really retarding the camshaft or advancing it a whole lot. But again, this chain does have a little bit of play in it because it was a line hone. So we also have to remember that too. We're going to have a little bit of a variance, and it makes it just slightly harder. I wouldn't say to degree the camshaft because this one, I'm especially with the opening and closing events, they were within a half a degree. And the intake center line, now that one's a little trickier because, and this is where you're going to have probably on your intake center line, this is where that variance could have been in the way that I set up my dial indicator. So your intake center line, you're going to measure, if you can imagine the lobe, right? So let's say there's an illustration here. So you got this line that goes up. So imagine that this line is the very top of the lobe. This line would represent 50 thousandths under that line, and this one would be over that line. You take this number on your degree wheel, you add it to whatever this comes out to on this side on the degree wheel, and you add them and you divide them by 2, and then you get your intake center line that way, if that makes sense to you guys. Now, the reason why it can vary is because the top of the lobe is going to have a little bit of rock in it. You're going to have a couple of thousandths before it moves either way. And that can make all the difference. So I believe that by the intake opening and closing sequences, we're within a half a degree. We are within 2 degrees on the intake center line, which is still a good window to have because the important part is that the opening and closing sequences are there. The intake center line, it's within that range. In my opinion, we're good. Some people may disagree. But again, this is where when you're trying to set your dial indicator to 0 in between here, you're going to have to find that sweet spot right in between. And you're within a couple of thousandths of that sweet spot. So it can vary. So that's probably where our 2 degrees of variance is coming from, if you ask me. So I think we're good. I'm happy with what I got. The timing set is set dot to dot, and we're good. And this is a nice Cloys, this is a nice Cloys 9-way adjustable, timing set. It's a high quality set. It works really well. But on the flip side, I have a Cloys set here. I've used this before. Did I say that weird? This is standard Cloys 3-way adjustable double roller. I've had those as much as 4 degrees. So, the more you spend in that department, the better off you're going to be. And this one literally degreed in, went perfect. So from here, I start assembling the bottom half of the engine, timing cover, get it all done. I'll put the heads on it. I'll have to measure for push rods, and I'm going to need rocker arms. And, you know, I can use my Harlan Sharps for at least the push rod length. But what you guys got to keep in mind is that, so there's going to be a slight difference, but not a whole lot, because I'm running a Ford rocker arm on my Oldsmobile engine. They're actually the rocker arms my buddy bought for this engine. He gave them to me as a thank you for helping him rebuild the diff for his C10. We put a Yukon Posi in and a 390 some 6 odd years ago or something like that. Truck's long gone. And I've been running them ever since. And they're a good, nice Pro Comp stainless steel rocker arm. A lot of guys don't like them. I've had good success with them. Now, the problem is the angles of the cylinder head are slightly different, right? And there's some disagreements on this, but I'm kind of interchanging brands here, right? So, you know, your rocker arm sits in there on an angle. And when it's on an angle, if you mill it, it's going to, you know, this isn't like, you know, it's going to change this where this opening part sits. So on mine, I didn't mill the area. Now, on the cylinder heads, I'm talking about where the rocker arm studs sit, because the studs will raise up. By the time you add your guide plates on an Oldsmobile, you're raising up that pad 60 to 100 thousandths. And what happens is when you raise it, it's changing this slot a little bit. And I found this out when I went to this camshaft. You start really running into issues with cams over 550 lift. This camshaft is over 550 lift on this engine. And what was happening is when the exhaust or the intake valve would open, the what I would call the intake, facing the intake side of this opening, would hit the poly lock and it would push the stud around. And oh God, did this thing idle horrible on the run stand until I figured out that problem. And I'm very glad that I caught it, because, you know, it's moving around, and that's not good for the valve either. So, and this is where your contact pattern matters, but I'll touch on that in a little bit. So either way, what I did to aid my problem was I bought a set of poly locks for a stud girdle. They're a lot thinner of a diameter. It gave me enough clearance to not smack the rocker arm body into the poly lock. And then I went further into my push rod measurement, right? So the ideal push rod length was like 75 thousandths longer. So I kind of settled in between, and I actually have like a Ford FE engine push rod in here from Comp Cams, which was like the perfect length. Now, and this is where I'm going to touch on pattern. My pattern on the valve stem, where this roller goes, wasn't dead center. Some Oldsmobile guys, specifically in the Oldsmobile world, as far as I know, really, really drive this point where it's like, it's got to be dead center, if not the geometry is wrong. Well, here's the problem. If you could be dead center, but you got to make sure it's got no sweep. But the most important part on your contact pattern is to be near center with no sweep. Because if this rocker arm roller tip sweeps on the valve, it'll move the valve. So when it opens up, it'll push the valve against the guide, and it'll start to wear the guide out prematurely. Especially if you're really beating on things and you're racing this car and you're pushing it, it's going to see a lot of extreme pressures. So that's why it's important when you get your rocker arm, you check for your proper push rod length, and you make sure that pattern on the valve stem does not sweep. It's got to be a thin contact pattern with no sweep. It could just, as long as it's near center, it's fine. I've ran them way off before, and I never blew the guides out of anything. But again, before I knew some of this stuff, I've learned a lot of this stuff just as I go, or people that I talk to, I've picked things up that they've been talking about. So yeah, those are things that we're going to touch on the further we get into this. And I've learned a lot of that on my stuff, how important it is. And that's why I have these Harlan Sharps. They're going to go on this engine. But that's not the main reason. The main reason is that this camshaft is a solid lifter cam that sees a lot more pressure, a lot more extremes. And my valve lash settings on this engine always vary a little bit when I check them. I can check them one day and they'll be off a little bit by 1 and sometimes by 3. I'm getting like a 2 thou variance 3, really, if you think about it, which isn't good, but it's not horrible, I guess. But I'm running the thin rocker arm studs. I need to drill and tap my cylinder heads for a bigger rocker arm stud, which I'm going to do in the future when I pull the engine out. So that's important for valve train stability. As pressures go up, things want to move around, and that's why you want a really good rocker arm stud, especially if you're running a really aggressive camshaft with a lot more spring pressures and stuff. And that stuff really starts to affect things, because if your rocker arm stud moves around, it's going to rock the valve around as well, and it's going to start beating things up. You can wear a valve out unevenly. It'll drop it if it's severe enough. Just stuff like that. So I've learned that stuff over the years, and that's why I have these. And I was supposed to put the rocker arms out of this engine on there, but essentially I'm not touching anything until we're in the clear with everything that's going on in the world. I really don't feel like spending any money due to the uncertainty of life, unless I really need to. But I am gonna buy the rocker arms push rods for this engine to get it done. So I'm sure I've already bored you guys, but I will let you go. Share, like, subscribe. If you want to follow me on Instagram, you can follow me as Copper Cutlass. I do have a page on Facebook that I don't really do a whole lot on, but it's Copper's Garage. You got to look it up as Copper's Garage, not Copper Cutlass. So I will see you guys when I get the piston rings, hopefully tomorrow afternoon. See you.